Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to be here exchanging with you about the future of conservatism. I just want to take a few minutes to reflect with you about the shift which is currently happening thanks to Brexit in European conservatism. And my key statement for today will be that we have been living for more than 20 years under the umbrella of the German conservatism, Christian Democrat conservatism, and now British conservatism is becoming the pole of a new European conservatism. We have to think about the consequences. Well, after 3.5 years, Brexit at last became real. And I would say under very good conditions at the end, because Boris Johnson's government is today in a strong position when it starts negotiations with the European Union. We can even say that there is now panic in Brussels. Did you hear last Friday, perhaps you shouldn't listen to him too much, but the French president began by explaining that the Brexit campaign in 2016 was a lie, a manipulation, and then he promised that the British would remain our friends. Well, sometimes it's hard to say right or wrong, my country, you know. More seriously, the European Union is announcing a tough stance in the negotiations. Well, I'm very struck by the contrast between the favorishness of now and the arrogance of 3 or 2 years ago towards Theresa May's government. Something is happening, however, which is much more important than the moods of continental technocrats. The British Conservative Party has become, again, I would say, the new pole of European conservatism. Until now, this role had been occupied by the German Christian democracy. But nothing is more symbolic than the passing of the torch, I would say, from Mrs. Merkel to Boris Johnson in less than 4 years. Well, it took 4 years, but if you think about this huge shift, I think it didn't last for so long. In 2015, in September 2015, Angela Merkel took a solitary decision to open in an unrestricted manner borders to refugees from conflicts in the Middle East and Africa. This decision, we know that, this is documented, this decision was taken against the recommendations of the border police in Germany and against the wishes of one of the coalition partners, the Bavarian Christian Social Union. Within a few months, more than 1 million people entered Germany. Some of them were real refugees, others took the opportunity. There were also, I have to mention it because this was never said by the French government, there were also these terrorists who passed among the others before committing attacks on French soil in November 2015. This is the crude reality of mass immigration to Germany in the autumn of 2015. Unfortunately, no reaction came from France at that time. The leaders of our country are far too prisoners of a naive vision of French-German friendship. They didn't dare say anything at that time. It was in Britain that something decisive happened. When you look closely at the result of the Brexit referendum 9 months later, you see that the issue of immigration has tipped the vote towards leaving the European Union. I know there was the major question of sovereignty of parliament, voting your own laws. But I think that what made the difference, what was essential to bring the victory of Brexit was the immigration issue. Angela Merkel may never have realized this, but she is the first person responsible for Britain's vote to leave the European Union. Yes, perhaps we should thank her. Firstly, she didn't take seriously what David Cameron told her about the risk of Brexit if he didn't come back with substantial concessions in the negotiations, and then mainly by her immigration policy. Well, we have to keep in mind that it was during Angela Merkel's time in the Chancellery that German Christian democracy changed its nature. Coming from the very secularized East Germany, Angela Merkel is representative, sadly, of a Protestantism emptied of its spiritual substance, which becomes impossible to differentiate from progressivism. She has moved her party to the left, first by governing with the Social Democrats, or by publicly criticizing Pope Benedict, remember in 2008, or by wanting the Greens as political allies with the abrupt decision to leave to step out of the civil nuclear industry, and then certainly also by her decision on immigration, but also let's remember the rather pathetic way she pushed same-sex marriage before the last general election in Germany, while ostensibly abstaining in the vote in parliament. This was really pathetic. The result was not long in coming. It emerged on the right of the Christian Democratic Union and a Christian Social Union, a party called Alternative für Deutschland, Alternative for Germany. Well, I know that some representatives of this party are here, and I will put it extremely bluntly. On one side, I hope that you will become the core of a new German conservatism. On the other side, I must say, please, German friends, get out of your ambiguity about the Nazi dictatorship. Don't remain prisoners of silly debates you do not deserve to have with your opponents. I put it bluntly, but we need you. But please do your own effort. And well, this is a fact now with Brexit. This is the conservatism of the 21st century, which is now really thriving. You will tell me that this conservatism is as old as Benjamin Disraeli himself. Hasn't Boris Johnson given substance again to the one nation conservatism? In fact, I think it must be understood that British conservatism had declined as a model since the end of the Second World War, before Margaret Thatcher. With Winston Churchill, it had been identified with the most heroic British patriotism, and then came the Reconstruction, the rallying to the vision of the welfare state. Until the 1970s, the Labour Party was rather the intellectually dominant party in British politics. The Conservative Party had lost its originality. Then in the late 1960s, we, as National Conservatives, we should also remember Enoch Powell, who warned of the dangers of the beginning of mass immigration. But at that time, he was very strongly rebuffed by all the political correctness of his time. Just as he was not allowed really to express his fears about membership of the European community. 10 years later, Margaret Thatcher took over some of Enoch Powell's argument against the Wets in the Conservative Party. She pushed the argument, the agenda against federal European community, but above all, she was able to reinvigorate the party by bringing it to a clear stance in favor of free market. Well, 30 or 40 years later, we can say the Iron Lady, on one side, as a staunch Methodist, kept the image of the Protestant ethics of capitalism, dear to Max Weber. But perhaps her partial failure was the inability to combine sovereignism, ethics, and economics, or at least that her successors keep the balance between free market ethics and sovereignism in a sustainable way. She was in some way betrayed by the baby boomers, who were more fascinated by the potential of modern financial markets than by ethics. She was politically betrayed, as we know, sadly, by her own party, which rallied to globalist neoliberalism after driving her out of power. The British Conservatives at that time, along with John Major, partly rallied to the Europe of the German Christian Democrats. Well, they couldn't go as far as France or as Helmut Kohl proposed. They kept one foot outside, not entering the euro. This was a wise decision. And then they let themselves be overtaken by Tony Blair's Labour in terms of European commitment and zeal. In 1997, as we know, the British Conservatives lost power for 13 years. Precisely, what has reinvigorated the Conservatives were the ever-increasing advances towards a European federalism. And then there was the political surprise of 2010 when Gordon Brown, Tony Blair's successor, lost power after calling an old lady, a Labour activist, a bigot because she had addressed him about immigration during his political campaign. Then the then Prime Minister David Cameron, when he came to power, felt he had no choice but to take seriously the concerns of British voters, first about immigration, then about the European Union and about British sovereignty. The setting for the referendum was in place, and Cameron was re-elected in 2015 while promising a referendum. In contrast, yes, I'm almost at the end of mine. The old Christian democracy of the European continent had advocated the construction of Europe with a view to peace after 2 world wars. But we have to put the question today, is it possible to join this European construction, or to stay, in this European construction on the one hand, when it has become the vector of mass immigration, especially coming from countries that do not respect the distinction of religion and politics, and when, on the other hand, it is the European Parliament who is the strongest vector of all excesses in the so-called bioethical sector. All the German Christian Democrats who did not oppose Angela Merkel while she was drifting towards a progressive mainstream became the grave diggers of a German conservatism that still had, under Helmut Kohl, its coherence. So I would say we are facing now the reality of a new decade. Let's say that the most important lesson of what happened in Britain is that it's only when you are able to exercise your full sovereignty that you can overcome the harshest, the strongest internal crisis. This is the unforgettable lesson that General de Gaulle taught France and Europe. And we are happy to see now that Britain is doing the same. Well, we European conservatives, we know also that we can rely on both the new British government, but we know also that we can count on Donald Trump's national conservatism. The Anglo-American world is against the bearer of a true and strong conservatism. We know, and this is my conclusion, we know that political conservatism is only complete when it puts the defense of freedom at the heart of the sovereignist project. This is the lesson of the British election, and what we are seeing emerging is the courageous struggle in Europe of the Visegrad Group countries, the emergence of new conservatism in Latin Europe, and thanks to the vitality of the Anglo-American conservative revival, we now have the possibility of affirming again that Western values may be a reality because they will find practical places to be deployed. So we know, basically, that our epoch is crossed in Europe or in the United States by terrible contradictions, but we can safely say that the common ideal that brought Ronald Reagan and John Paul II together is still alive and well alive. Thank you.